Take it away, Jane.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So nice to meet all of you. Happy to see some of, my department being represented. So I was a graduate student in the psychology department at Columbia. I graduated in 2022. Time kind of flies, so I had to think about when it was. So currently I work as a behavioral scientist. I'm the head of behavioral science at a company called Healogix. So we can talk more specifically about it later, but basically I pursued behavioral science right out of my PhD. First job was at Walgreens in the corporate office. I was there for a couple of years. Did a broad array of work there, ranging from user experience to health equity to kind of like digital journey work across the board. And then now I do really focused work in the pharmaceutical sector in behavioral science. So I'm obviously happy to chat more about any of that you're interested in. And Francesca and I'll have a conversation about it. But I just want to say, like, any questions you guys have on the table. I know some questions can be kind of sensitive to ask. Open book. I know that it's kind of a black box, pursuing this type of career after graduate school. So anything I can do to help, just let me know. Okay.
Thank you. I know we all appreciate that. Great. So thank you for that. Yeah, short overview. If you could tell us a little bit more about your current position, kind of maybe some of the day to day. What do you find yourself doing in your role?
hmm So my day-to-day varies. So I'll give you kind of a brief overview, first of all, about like what our company does and kind of where I'm situated within it. So healthcare and pharmaceutical companies need research. They need research about who their customer base is, their patients are, et cetera. Some of that is around clinical trials. We're not doing clinical trials. We're doing kind of, the softer side of things of how do patients think about a certain medication? How do patients interact with their providers? What do providers think about a certain medication? What do providers need in terms of the support to best make decisions that are serving a diverse array of patients? So they come to us and say, we need help. We don't know about this topic and we need you to execute this research. Sometimes it's purely exploratory. Sometimes they're trying to verify a hypothesis they might have. Sometimes they're trying to maybe enact a certain type of behavior. So obviously, they're pharmaceutical companies. They're trying to have people buy their products. And so that's where I come in, and I basically run research for them. The research can be qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods. It's kind of up to me as to how I want to address a certain question. Some clients that I have are much more in the weeds of research. They'll say, I want a qualitative study. I want this many participants. I want, these questions asked. And other ones say, I kind of have a topic. I have no idea what to do to address this topic. I don't even have a question. Here's some money. Can you just help me run a project? And so, my clients are very diverse in terms of kind of where they come to us in terms of the research process, their background in research, and their expectations. And so it's kind of cool because I'm basically doing everything that I was doing as a graduate student in terms of executing projects. But I have people pay me to do it. So that's kind of at a high level what my job is. My day-to-day varies. So some days I'm on a lot of calls with clients talking about a project they want to do. Sometimes I'm, in the weeds of developing a discussion guide. So that's what I was doing about 5 minutes ago is, developing a qualitative discussion guide for some patient interviews that are kicking off at the end of the week. And sometimes I'm, kind of in more of like a sales role. So I'm on a call with a client trying to say, here's why you should, use my company as opposed to a different company. And here's all the different capabilities that we have. So that was kind of one thing that was different from my graduate years. I wasn't selling any research besides to like, a conference to accept me, right? Or a journal to accept my paper. And so kind of like navigating to a sales role, as a vice president at the company, that's kind of one differentiator, as I'm both a doer and a seller of research. So that was kind of a big change in this role, but that's kind of what my day-to-day is. It's really flexible. I kind of work when I want to. I technically work East Coast hours, but sometimes I'll cut out at 2 to walk my dog and then come back to work after dinner. So as long as the work is done, that's kind of what my team cares about. So my day-to-day is really kind of what I want it to be. Of course, I have to show up to meetings, but as long as my other work is done, that's kind of how it functions.
Nice. Thank you, James. And something I guess I thought was interesting too, when we chatted before, and you were telling me about behavioral science roles, you mentioned that kind of like the jobs really differ depending on the company, the team, the organization. And so I thought that that was something too, maybe if you could expand upon that a little bit, because I know if you just look for behavioral science roles, it might not, they kind of differ depending on the location.
Exactly. So behavioral science is a relatively newer field in industry. User experience is still relatively newer, but it's still been around. Market research has been around. Consulting obviously has been around. Behavioral science, people don't know what to do with. They kind of, know it's like this buzzword that is being thrown around, and they kind of, are hearing whispers throughout the industry, oh, you have to hire a behavioral scientist. And they're like, oh, shoot, we need a behavioral scientist. Where do we find one? And so they kind of put out this like nebulous job ad of like, we need a behavioral scientist. And they really have no idea kind of what that job is. That's the case for some places, most of the places that I've interacted with. Some companies, more of like the tech world, they're more familiar with behavioral science. So Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, Google, they know behavioral science, right? They have built out teams of, hundreds of people who are behavioral scientists, and they kind of know how to function with them. Other industries like the one I'm in. So prior to this, I worked at Walgreens. That was more in the healthcare space. Now I'm in pharmaceuticals. They kind of don't know what to do with behavioral scientists, which is kind of cool because you can kind of make your own job. At my last company, I had a couple of behavioral scientists who I worked with. At my new company, it's a 50-person company, and so I'm the only behavioral scientist. I'll be growing out a team of my own over the next couple of years. And so that's kind of a cool thing because they came in and said, well, what ideas do you have for us? And I just kind of pitched, here's some things I'd like to do in terms of, how my background in social psychology can, I think, help your business grow. Does this sound good? And they're like, yeah, let's do it. And so I really am kind of creating my own path at this company in terms of how we market behavioral science, how we incorporate into the work that we're doing experimentally, what types of products and research offerings that we're providing to our clients. It's basically completely uncharted territory for us. And so whatever I asked for, they kind of just say yes. And it was very similar in my last company too. And so that was kind of something that was really appealing to me, that I can kind of do whatever I want. That flexibility was really appealing to me. So that's kind of, one, I think, neat area or one neat aspect of behavioral science post academia.
Yeah, it's a developing, growing field, and often there's more flexibility in those newer growing fields.
Yeah.
Great. So I guess tell us a little bit about your first position at Walgreens. Like, how did you go about getting that role? Give us, kind of I think people are like, how do I get that job? How do I even get a role? So maybe even some of like the brass tacks of the process.
Sure. So finding a job after academia is quite challenging at times, right? And, I think we all kind of know this. I was especially, interested in more of kind of I don't know, off the beaten path type of job. I wasn't opposed to working in, straight up user experience or market research, but I kind of wanted to do something where I could actually apply like my social psychology background. So I applied for, very, very, very broadly, a whole, kind of smattering of jobs. And I realized I actually had no idea like what the jobs that I was applying for were. Like I kind of knew what user experience was. I thought it was kind of like, I don't know, do people like the red button or the blue button? And like that was kind of like what I thought it was. Um, Market research, I again, kind of nebulous idea, behavioral science. I initially didn't consider because when you talk to another social scientist, the connotations of like what a behavioral scientist is in academia, super different from what it means in industry. In industry, it means like you're kind of a social like social scientist who can run a study. Like that's basically what it means in industry. If I said that at a psychology conference, it would come with a whole set of connotations that I just wasn't, right? Um, for context, I studied social and cognitive development at Columbia, how kids think about incarceration. So I definitely was like not an easy sell in the market, right? And I definitely wasn't initially thinking about behavioral science because it was just not what I really did in my degree. Um, but then I started talking to people. I did a lot of networking for about a year, 6 months to a year, seriously. I was looking for jobs. And I started talking to people, and they were like, oh, yeah, like, behavioral science and industry, it's not like what it is in academia. It's not like you have to be at a business school studying, fundamental attribution error and like all these like very specific like topics to like make you a behavioral scientist. And I was like, oh, like I could run a study. I could maybe do behavioral science stuff. And so I started kind of, branding myself a little bit on LinkedIn as, a mixed methods researcher who was a behavioral scientist, had maybe some capability in UX market research, kind of everything. Um, I basically, did that and I started to kind of titrate like what worked on my LinkedIn in terms of the verbiage that I was using. Um, and I eventually, stumbled across my job on LinkedIn through a networking opportunity. And, I formally applied for the job in January and I got it in February. So it was definitely an interesting experience overall in terms of like, the job application process. But, I'd say so many jobs that you're looking for are found just through connections and networking and referrals and all that kind of stuff. And so I cannot stress that enough. That is, I think, probably the most important thing you can do in your job search, going forward, if that's what you're interested in. Um, cold applying for jobs, like it happens where you can do that on LinkedIn and it can work out. It's not like I think some people like catastrophize it and say like you're never gonna hear back if you just cold apply. You can, but it's a lot easier through networking. And I found both my jobs after academia through networking. So tactically, I think that's kind of the way to go because a lot of the types of jobs that are out there, you just probably don't have a lot of insight to because you're not interfacing it with, a day to day. So talking to people in industry, specifically at those companies, they can give you a lot of insight as to what that role actually is. And then once they find out you're a reasonable person, you can ask them to refer you for the job, and 99% of times they will. So that's kind of tactically how I would suggest going about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I agree. Like networking is really important just in terms of like learning about different roles and industries to see if it's a better fit for you, as well as those referrals. But yeah, cold applications still do work. So you kind of have to use a method, like a mixed method, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But yeah, so what made you though choose your current role in industry? Like, were there specific factors that maybe led you away from an academic setting?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, I think the biggest thing, to be honest with you, was I wanted control over my life. I have a partner. We've been together for 10 plus years at this point. And, he was applying to residency at the same time I was finishing up my PhD program. And I just didn't think that 10 years into our relationship was the right time to start doing long distance. And so, we're very fortunate that my partner, matched as top choice in residency at University of Chicago. Um, Unlike other residencies where they're a couple years long, his is 7 years long. So we were going to be in Chicago, right, for a long time. I'm from Chicago originally, and so we very much wanted to kind of put our roots down in a place and kind of just like stay there, not move, every couple of years for my job and his job and all that kind of stuff. And so, I just kind of thought practically, what are the chances that I would get a postdoc? What are the chances that I would get a faculty position all in the same city, going forward? And, a risk calculation said it's going to be pretty low and high risk for you to, kind of plan that. And so I loved academia. I loved kind of what it had to offer. But at the end of the day, I just thought that it didn't give me control over my life. And that's not like an amazing feeling, right? And so that was kind of, I'd say, the biggest factor into my decision-making process. Second thing, and like maybe it's like a bad thing to say, but like money, like I kind of didn't want to make 40 grand a year anymore. And I was kind of like, wow, like all these people who I went to college with, who I was like, oh, like they're just going to business after school. Like I'm so smart, I'm gonna get a PhD. They kind of like, progressed their lives, right? They, were able to go on vacations and buy a house and like do stuff. And I'm like in my lab, like typing away like for 40 grand, right? And so like I was kind of like, I kind of want to change with that kind of stuff. So, maybe it's a bad thing to say, but that was, another really, really big motivation for me as well. So I'd say those are kind of the two biggest things.
I don't think money is, I think in an academic setting, sometimes money seems dirty, but like, we in it versus the pursuit of knowledge in the mind.
Right.
But I do think that, we live in a capitalistic society and we work for, yes, it's nice to have work with purpose, but to also make sure that you're having a wage that allows you and a salary that allows you to have a lifestyle that you feel comfortable with. And I think that that is a big factor of considering work. So yes, it is one factor, and you have to consider, I guess, for each person has to consider how compensation, how that work value, where is that of importance for you in terms of your career search, right? So yeah, I don't think that I'm glad you bring that up, James, because I don't think we talk about that enough, really. Yeah, and I thought that it was kind of, interesting when we chatted last time. You were like, I was really enjoyed academics, the academic setting, had lots of publications. You had almost every intention of going that way, but then once you realize that the opportunities in your location were not going to be available, then that's when you had to make the switch. And location is another one of those factors that I think can dictate your job search, and you might not consider that earlier.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, like location was super, super important for us. You know, first of all, another thing that I think not enough people talk about in academia is like when you take it, like you're kind of expected to take a job anywhere, right? Um, I wasn't gonna live in certain places where like my identity, for example, as a gay man, like wouldn't be like accepted. And I remember talking to a professor who is a gay man himself, not at Columbia, but at a different New York City institution. And I was like, you came from a school, in the South, like, how was that? And he was like, oh, like, it's fine. Like, there's kind of like some homophobia, but like, you kind of just like get over it. And I was like, whoa, like, that's so crazy. Like that you said that to me. And like, you were like, oh, it's okay. Like, I did it, so you should do it too. So I think that like that's another thing that's completely valid to think about as well. Like you don't have to live anywhere where you don't want to. Industry allows you to have that flexibility and that choice. So like any consideration you have is a valid one. And like even if people are kind of like in the back of your head, like telling you what you should think, I think you can, you know, think for yourself, right? And like know what's best for you in that instance.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that that location can play a large part in that as well. And again, those values, what are you valuing? A good question to ask yourself. So, what experiences in graduate school best prepared you for your current work, and how do you use your skills from your graduate program in your role?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I was kind of a hard sell in industry at face value, given kind of the content of my academic studies. So my lab at Columbia studied religion and morality. I primarily studied the morality components, but in the context of the criminal justice system, which is not something that industry particularly cares about. So when I showed up, to interviews, and I would kind of come and say, "Hi, I'm a social and moral psychologist, and I study how kids think about punishment, particularly in the justice system, because I'm really passionate about that myself." They'd be like, "Sir, this is Google. I don't know what you're doing here," Um, and so I was like, all right, so industry doesn't care about what I study. They don't care that I really know about this like really important societal thing. They want to know something else. So then after I kind of iterated, and I'd show up and say, "Hi, I'm a social psychologist. I'm primarily skilled in both quantitative and qualitative methods. I can, use X, Y, and Z softwares. And I'm really skilled at survey development and blah, blah, whatever." And I felt that was such like a vapid response to like, when they'd be like, tell us about who you are, because like obviously I can develop a survey, like I'm a PhD in psychology. Industry is like, wow, that's really important. And I was like, oh, okay, so they care about a completely different set of like things that you're talking about. They want to know that you have like the methodological skill set in order to do the job. For certain people, if they kind of probed like this type of stuff that I, worked on, and I could tell they were interested, I would kind of go into that. But it's not what I led with, for sure. And so I really, really kind of like leaned on like the methodological stuff, the statistical analysis stuff, all of that when I was on the job market. Um, when I, was talking to some companies that had a little bit more societal impact orientation. So like Walgreens, for example, the position I was hired for had a lot of kind of like health equity component stuff built into it. And so there I would lean a little bit more heavily into my background as well. But for this job where it's a pharmaceutical company, less of like a health equity bent to it, I definitely didn't kind of like lean into my topical expertise as much, and it was much more like a methodological type thing. And so I'd say in 80 to 85% of the interviews I've had, it was the thing that got me to the next round was that I could talk about research, I could talk about it well, articulate myself around it, and to show that I could make an impact in the organization. So that's kind of like, that took me a while to figure out. They don't care about my knowledge area of expertise. They want to know that I have a skill set that they can rely on.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember you mentioning that to me too, is that it's kind of like, and I think this is often when I talk to students in one-on-one advising about, is finding the language
Right.
to promote yourself to employers in those skills. And sometimes it takes a translation. And yeah, maybe rather than the specifics, it's more the methodologies, the
Right.
skill set, as you said. Um, yeah. So last question before we open it up for Q&A. So get your questions ready. So what advice do you have for current PhD students at any stage of their career? It could be nearing graduation or just like, what advice would you have for folks, navigating their PhD here at Columbia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that, some piece of advice I would definitely hone in on exploring, right? Like I think that a lot of times you can get sucked into kind of, working with an advisor, and you're just so, focused on that end goal of publishing and just like the next study and the next like academic milestone. But check in on industry options kind of along the way. You don't have to commit. Like stuff like this is exactly kind of the stuff I think you're supposed to be doing, right? Talk to people on LinkedIn, even if you don't know them. The number of times I would cold message people on LinkedIn being like, I see you have a PhD in psychology. I don't know you. Can you, spare 20, 30 minutes out of your day? Can you talk to me about your job? Can you talk to me about how you transitioned out of academia? And people emphatically will just say yes to you. They get it, right? They get, that it's not a linear pathway for a lot of us. It's not an easy, change. And so a lot of people are super, super willing to do that. I think just like other pieces of advice would be to like to build up your skill set. I'd say like technicality wise along the way. So, you don't have to be the most, skilled statistician, right? In my job, I do t-tests and ANOVAs and regressions and correlations, and people are truly so appreciative of that work, which, that's kind of table stakes, right, for being a grad student. But if you can kind of hone any of those, even like relatively basic skills, and then anything that goes kind of above that is kind of icing on the cake for, any fancier type jobs you want to apply to in that area, that would be fantastic. And then I guess just like, I don't know, like thinking about how to like frame your research, thinking about how to, and just like kind of how to brand yourself, after your degree. I spent about a year applying to jobs and all of that kind of stuff, and 6 months really kind of titrating how to brand myself, and initially, like I said, when I was branding myself as like a social moral psychologist, that wasn't working. And so I basically took different types of jobs, and I tried to create a story of who I was in each of those fields. So, for market research, for example, a lot of stuff in market research is about messaging, right? So, I would basically go into my studies that I did and say, when have I studied anything kind of tangential related to this? Turns out that one of my main lines of work was around how children explain incarceration and how those explanations shape social perceptions and bias and all of that kind of stuff. I was like, all right, that sounds kind of like messaging, right? And so then I would create a story around that, right? And I would make the conceptual linkages. So you don't have to, like, for every study you're doing, be like, oh, like, how is this relating to industry? Like, that's not feasible or like even like probably smart to do, right? Because you just like do your job, for what you have to do. But you can start thinking about the types of job categories that you want and then kind of reflect as you're going along. Okay, like what's the story I can tell for how this might relate to some other job in the future, right? Once I did that and had it all written down and all that kind of stuff, like my job search went a lot easier. And it just became a lot more seamless when I was applying for jobs. I think those are probably like the main takeaways. I'd say maybe one more is that if you can get any sort of like hands-on experience, like internship, any of that kind of stuff, that will make your life a lot easier going forward. I know sometimes your advisor probably doesn't like that kind of stuff. But sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. So if you can get any sort of experience like that before applying to jobs, that could be really helpful as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think thank you for those. Those are ones that I often share with students as myself. Yeah, kind of going back to like that marketing of yourself. Something I wrote down that you had mentioned was you kind of realized that like you were able through your research to study and think about how people change sticky beliefs. And like that's something that you marketed that skill is like
Yeah,
morality is sticky, right? Just as like your healthcare choices can be sticky. And so how do we study that and change that? And I thought that was
yeah,
interesting. Yeah, finding that narrative in that story is really important. And networking and informational interviewing can help you with that, right? Is practicing
exactly.
that with others.
I would even sometimes talk to people and be like, hey, this is going to sound crazy, but can I like tell you how I might talk about my skill set to you or how I might talk about my background? They'd be like, yeah, sure, go for it. And I like pitch them and they'd be like, that sounds weird. Or they would be like, no, that actually sounds reasonable. And so like I could kind of get feedback through those experiences. Um, and so really use those informational interviews to, help in kind of any way that you can. I mean, obviously I wouldn't like talk to like a hiring manager and be like, hey, like which pitch do you like? But if it was like somebody who like just came out of grad school, kind of was like in the same boat as me, that's the right venue for that kind of stuff. Um, but completely agree that, those types of informational interviews can be super, super helpful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I am going to